Greetings and welcome to In-Depth. I'm Dike Rostant. We are about to have a conversation with international climate law and governance specialist, as well as director of the Climate Analytics Caribbean, Rueanna Haynes, who is at the forefront of some work that is quite timely and very important. Thank you so much for joining us, Ms. Haynes. How are you doing?
I'm good. Thank you so much, Dike, for the invitation. Can I call you Dike, by the way?
Yeah, man, please do. And with a jet-setting traveler like you, I mean, it's par for the course. But let's start off, please, in terms of getting an idea of or an overview of Climate Analytics Caribbean, please.
Sure. Well, Climate Analytics Caribbean is the newest of several offices of our parent organization, Climate Analytics GmbH, that's based in Berlin, Germany. The Climate Analytics as a whole, is a global climate science and policy institute that has been working to ensure that we can limit global warming to within 1.5 degrees Celsius. The aim of our work is to essentially save the climate for present and future generations. Climate Analytics Caribbean, we are implementing this overall vision with a focus on climate justice.
And the two things that I want to go into, and I'll ask them distinctly, thank you. What is the importance of having a space that looks at both the science and policy? Because sometimes it feels as though people are across the divide shouting at each other, whether or not it's happening or it's not happening, what we should do with the empirical evidence. So in terms of like the science being interwoven with the policy, what's the impact of that?
It's really key. And I think this is what has made Climate Analytics as an organization so unique. The work began in 2008, exactly with that intent of bridging the divide. I mean, it's a completely different language between those who are researching the climate science and those who are trying to make the policy. And, in the context of the global climate discussion that's established under the Framework Convention on Climate Change, there was a real need to make the science more policy relevant. And so, in order to ensure that the decisions that governments are taking are really in line with what the science is saying is necessary.
And that second question, thank you for that, though. Sometimes when your parents make the rules and you need to abide by those rules and you're not able to do exactly what it is you want to. Talk to me a little bit about the fact that Climate Analytics Caribbean has chosen as part of its focus to look at climate justice, please. Is that something that you're able to? Is it a level of autonomy that you have? What is that relationship like?
Actually, no. In terms of the work of the broader organization, everything that we do fits into the same question of the climate science and the climate policy. Climate justice is just a thematic focus that we have to ensure that our work is fully aligned with the realities on the ground within the Caribbean region, where what we've seen in the Caribbean is yet another disconnect between how we understand the issues here, how we speak about the issues here, and the global discussion. So that's really the space that we are working in as Climate Analytics Caribbean. We have chosen to focus it through a climate justice lens because climate justice is extremely broad, and we can address it from many different areas. So there's this aspect of just having the access to information, which is a part of the climate justice drive, ensuring that those who really need the information actually have access to the information. Those who are, the most vulnerable on the front lines are able to understand what is happening, that they have the tools to understand what's happening, ensuring that the climate finance that is available, that people even know that it's available, that we are helping to channel it to where it's truly needed on the ground. So there's no I would say, substantive difference between the tools and the work that we do in Climate Analytics Caribbean and what the global organization is doing, because our work is still very much grounded in the science, in the policy, But what we are doing is making it relevant to the Caribbean context.
Like, I keeping this two-part question together now. So you said it's very broad, but give me a base definition for climate justice. Thank you. And in terms of that information aspect that you spoke about, what are some of those factors that go into saying, okay, well, this is funding, these are resources that are available for these types of endeavors, and how do you link those resources to the persons that need them?
So climate justice, I will say that there is no internationally agreed definition for the term. I will also say that right now, Climate Analytics Caribbean is working with the Caribbean Natural Resources Institute and a suite of other regional organizations in order to precisely create a Caribbean-specific approach to climate justice. But when we speak about climate justice, we're speaking about a few different things. We're speaking about access to justice for those who are being negatively impacted by climate change already. We're speaking about who does what in terms of sharing the burden of having to mitigate from climate change. We're also speaking about intersectionality in the climate discussion. When I first began participating in climate change global negotiations, there was very little talk about questions of human rights, for example, questions of gender, for example, and how these questions of racism and how these issues interact and interplay with climate change and approaches to addressing the climate crisis. And now we are seeing, I guess, a much more close alignment with those discussions. I will say that it's still nascent, it's still developing. I think there are more strides being made within particular regions than there are as yet at the global level, but gender has become a standing part of the discussion. Human rights has also become a standing part of the discussion, and all of these are integrated into what we mean by this umbrella term of climate justice. In relation to the second question, which is on precisely what we're doing as Climate Analytics Caribbean in terms of bridging that information divide, one of the issues that we identified before we opened the office, and as part of the reason why we opened the office, is that even though climate finance is available, it's not enough at the global level. It falls woefully short of what is needed. We need to be mobilizing trillions of dollars globally in order to be able to make an impact in addressing climate change. And right now, the amounts are in the billions. And out of that, what we are able to access as small island developing states is very, very small, especially when you think about the fact that, these are countries that are highly vulnerable to climate impacts. And the example that's given is always Hurricane Maria when it hit Dominica in 2017 and wiped out over 200% of their GDP. So when we think about the kinds of money that need to be mobilized for climate change, there's a huge gap as well in terms of what countries are able to access. But taking it even another level below that, when we look at Caribbean civil society as a whole that is operating in this space, their access to financing is even more limited. And that's one of the issues that we're hoping to be able to help address as a policy directive for Climate Analytics Caribbean. Any projects that we do in the region, we co-implement with other organizations as a means of getting the climate access to where it's truly needed on the ground.
And on the other side of the conversation, on the other side of the break, rather, I want to speak specifically to Caribbean-specific approaches, as well as some of the initiatives that you are doing in terms of Climate Analytics Caribbean. But just before we take that break, though, we have about a minute. Read and spell for me, please, Ms. Haynes. What are some of those things in terms of like the gender, racism? How are they articulated? Give me some examples of how they may find themselves articulated in the conversation around climate change. Thank you.
Well, at present, at the global level, I'll start there, there's a recognition that climate impacts are not experienced in the same way when we look at it through a gender lens globally, especially when we think about, societies that are in particular more focused on agriculture, where you have gendered roles when it comes to who provides the water, who does the cooking, who has to go out and actually hunt or gather in order to be able to keep households and communities going. Impacts of climate change fall unequally. So in situations where you have drought as a result of the increase in global warming, and you have women who are responsible for the water in a home, it means they have to go further in order to find water, in order to be able to support their home, and in order to be able to support the community. So this is the type of work that is, it has been done, it has been ongoing, but I would say more in regional and more local contexts, these considerations are being taken into account more and more at the global level. In terms of race, we have the conversation, for example, in parts of Latin America and in the US, where you see that climate change impacts are different depending on where you live. And sometimes where you live is determined by your race. So you have poorer communities that live closer to highways, for example, and are therefore more susceptible to health impacts that happen as a result of the emissions of greenhouse gases from cars. So, or live closer to factories that are, producing polluting substances into the atmosphere, into the water, and affecting, having a disproportionate impact on those of a particular race who may be marginalized. So this question of marginalization is key to that analysis. We know that climate change is going to impact those who are most vulnerable the most. And when we look at those who are most vulnerable from a gender lens, from a race lens, indigenous communities as well, it paints a much more vivid picture of what is meant by that.
And with that, we take a short break. Stay with us. We are speaking with Director of Climate Analytics Caribbean, Rueanna Haynes. We return with more. Welcome back. We are speaking with Climate Analytics Caribbean Director Rueanna Haynes, and we kind of did some world building, Ms. Haynes, and I want to get to a little more specificity, thank you, because there are a raft of activities that your organization is involved in. One that recently happened, I think it was via digital platforms. And what are some, so give me a little info about that. What was it like in terms of feedback as well? And as well, what are some of the other things that you're doing?
So one of our main flagship projects at the moment is actually a communications project. It's a communications campaign around what is called the global stocktake. So at the international level, within the global climate process established by the Framework Convention and the Paris Agreement, every 5 years, parties have agreed to take stock of where we are as the entire world in relation to our levels of climate action, the baseline reference, the three main goals of the Paris Agreement to limit warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius, to become a more resilient planet and to align financial flows with low carbon development. So you have these three headline goals of the Paris Agreement, and every 5 years, parties are supposed to stop and take stock, see how we're doing, how we're tracking. We know that we are wildly off track in relation to each goal. And then there's supposed to be a series of high-level political moments where states actually respond to the findings of the technical aspects of that process. So there's supposed to be a political moment. It's going to happen at the end of the year this year in Dubai at COP28, where heads of state and government will stop and say, okay, we've received the information. This is what we agree to do in order to address what has been brought to our attention. And in addition to the high-level meeting in Dubai, there is also going to be a high-level meeting hosted by the United Nations Secretary General in September to contribute to the discussion on this. So Climate Analytics Caribbean hosted an event for Earth Day, where we shared information about the global stocktake process, what's been happening so far, what the expectations are, because even though it is global and high level, the inputs have to be generated from the underground. The inputs have to be generated where the implementation or lack thereof, where the barriers are, also where potentially the solutions are. And so we have been working with other organizations, including Caribbean Natural Resources Institute, CANARI, to, first of all, generate some input. So there's now been a submission by regional civil society organizations on the global stocktake into the global process, but also through this campaign to get people involved at every level, including from the youth and everywhere, anyone we could reach.
And I like the fact that you talk about building that data almost like on a granular level from the ground up. So then you have that empirical evidence that you can make informed decisions on. And that takes me back to the commitment to speak to Caribbean specific approaches. Because sometimes it feels as though a solution can be handed down from on high, a copy and paste, but it doesn't fit the context that is being handed to. So what are some of the things that you look at, factors that you would be getting, considerations when trying to build these solutions from within the space for the space?
Yeah, so a few things, and you're absolutely right. One of the things we're trying to work toward is to ensure that the solutions that then come out of the process do actually suit our circumstances. And in order to do that, this is why it was important for us to be able to even have a submission from civil society going into the process, the technical part of the process. But I will say that regionally, governments have been involved. So there have been opportunities to actually represent the regional approach on this issue, and those opportunities have been taken by governments. Governments have been involved in the discussion through the Alliance of Small Island States within the climate negotiations. But what we are seeing, and it pains me to say this, but when you look at the global process, one of the first issues that we need to address is whether it will produce solutions at all. So the first hurdle that needs to be overcome is the need for solutions. There are many vested interests when it comes to the global discussion that are not necessarily interested in moving too far, too fast, and have really put forward some views that have slowed down the discussion, slowed down the process, put in question whether or not we will even be able to have solutions coming out of such an important global endeavor. So that's the first point. But even by generating information, generating ideas, understanding where the challenges lie, what the barriers are, for example, in relation to accessing climate finance and the many barriers that affect small island developing states, the many barriers that are impacting us here in Trinidad and Tobago as well, being able to represent these in that context also, creates conditions where there's an expectation that we need to see a response, and there's an expectation that we need to see solutions. When it comes to the design of these solutions, this is also key. And one thing the Alliance of Small Island States has been pushing for is the need for the technical aspects of the process to be able to be summarized in a way that's accessible to those who then have to implement, to those who are also making the policy, to civil society, who have to co-implement with governments in order to make sure that no one is left behind. This has also proven to be a struggle because there are those who do not want to see this type of action-oriented implementable outcomes coming from the global process, even though it's high time that we see these types of outcomes coming from the process. And also, I guess a Caribbean-specific approach as well would be the need for capacity building to accompany whatever the outcome is, so that we actually can have the technical assistance that is needed, the finance that is needed to be able to implement the outcome. Because the GST, the global stocktake process, is supposed to inform the level and the nature of parties' climate actions in the future, as well as now. So in 2025, states are expected to come back to the table with new climate pledges that we call nationally determined contributions in the context of the Paris Agreement. They're supposed to come back with new climate pledges, and they're supposed to take into account the outcome of the GST in the context of those pledges. So this process is supposed to provide a signal of political commitment to climate action, renewed political commitment to climate action, course correction, because we are off course in relation to the 1.5 degrees Celsius goal. But it's also supposed to trigger national action that governments have to take individually by 2025.
We have 2 minutes more, Ms. Haynes. We know that Climate Analytics Caribbean is not sitting on its hands. What are some of the initiatives, projects, aims that you have lined up working towards over like the next few months?
So in addition to our GST work, and there's a lot more to come in that space, we're producing a documentary that we hope to submit into the global process, where we're going to be doing interviews here in Trinidad, but also in St. Lucia and Belize, talking about stories from the region. We're also going to be having a competition where secondary school students can get involved in giving us their take on what the GST should produce, that we also hope to be able to feed into the global process. We also will be hosting additional webinars where we'll be providing more information, getting more feedback from people in terms of what they can expect. We're also working on, in a different project, we're also working on developing a model climate law that can be taken by individual governments in the region and used to create their own national climate change legislation. The creation of an enabling environment in order to be able to respond to climate change appropriately includes having the requisite policies and legislation in place. And when we look across the region, there are some countries who are at work getting this legislation in place, but for the most part, it's very patchy. And from our perspective, we thought that if we could create a model climate law, then that would be able to help governments to see, well, okay, maybe we can do this in relation to this, maybe we can do that. Because for the most part, when we're looking at developing legislation in the region, sometimes we're looking for sources that are not really relevant for regional circumstances in order to translate those laws. So we're hoping this model climate law can help to fill a gap and accelerate the efforts of governments in this regard.
And it's easy sometimes to dance around when there isn't a working model or definition. So you say, okay, well, like, you can't accuse me of this because there are many gray areas. But you spoke about Canary. How are other people able to reach out to you, try to engage, to be of service, to help, to become partners? Let us know that quickly before we wrap up. Thanks.
Thanks so much. Yes, you can reach us on Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, and LinkedIn at Climate Analytics Caribbean. So Climate Analytics Caribbean, don't forget the Caribbean part. That's where you'll find us.
And thank you so much, Rueanna Haynes, Director, Climate Analytics Caribbean. As she said, don't forget the Caribbean. And on behalf of the entire TTT News team, this has been In Depth with me, Dike Rostant. Thank you so much for joining us.